Good morning, subscribers. For those of you who have been following this series, this is the A-Level Economics Year 2, currently working through microeconomics. And yesterday I considered Chapter 5 in your OCR textbook, which is all to do with the growth of firms. Now, in this particular video, I'm not going to get into the whole notion of organic growth, mergers, vertical, horizontal, mergers and acquisitions, all of that. That's fairly straightforward sort of theory, which you can just learn and sort of regurgitate at the appropriate time. But what I do want to look at today and spend just a little bit of time sharing a few thoughts with you is this whole notion of market concentration. Very important. Did form the basis indeed of one of the practice papers for the September 2015 new reissued specification from OCR, so it's worth just taking a little bit of time to consider and reflect upon how this relates really to our whole aspect of the spectrum of competition, where we're looking at monopoly, duopoly, oligopoly, monopolistic competition, perfect competition, all of the things which you can find in my playlist on market structures. So I'm not going to explain all of those things again. I'm just assuming, ladies and gentlemen, that you know your stuff here. So, what do we mean by this notion of the concentration ratio? Well, in very simple terms, what we're doing is we're looking at the number of firms in an industry, and then we are seeing what market share is occupied by, let's say, the top 5 firms in the industry. So we talk about the N firm concentration ratio, N obviously standing for the number of. So in an exam, the examiner might ask you to calculate the 3 firm concentration ratio, in which case you simply look for the market share of the 3 largest firms and you add all of those percentages together, and that gives you the N firm concentration ratio. So let's say, for example, we had an N firm, 3 firm concentration ratio, which was 80%. So that would mean that the market is dominated by 3 very large firms, relatively large in size. But if the N firm, 3 firm concentration ratio was only 10%, that would mean that 3 firms occupied 10% of the market, leaving 90% probably for many other firms. So the N firm concentration ratio, the larger that number, the more likely it is that we're talking about a more concentrated market. So we're moving more towards this sort of anti-competitive, detrimental to the consumer, all good news for the producer sort of scenario. However, the less concentrated it is, the more in the interests of the consumer that will be, because there will be more firms, there will be more choice, price is likely to be lower. All of these things that we've considered when we've looked at all of these different aspects of market structures. So, how do we measure the N firm concentration ratio? Well, we can look at output, for example. So, if you were to take a declining industry nowadays, which is paper print newspapers, so if you looked at the circulation of those newspapers, that would be one way of measuring the market share of each newspaper, and then you could add the numbers together. Or you might wish to do it in terms of employment. So which 3 firms have the largest number of employees, and you could consider the concentration ratio based upon that. Now, one must remember, and especially nowadays as we move into the increasingly online and technological and more capital being substituted in place of people, we must remember that if you look at output on one hand and you look at employment on the other, you might get totally the different answer. So for example, if we consider the newspaper print industry, that's very automated, isn't it, nowadays, especially the actual print of it. So that is highly capital intensive nowadays. So it might have massive circulation in terms of numbers of papers sold. However, in terms of employment numbers, that might actually be quite low. So you might get different answers depending upon whether you look at output or employment, especially if you're considering a capital intensive industry. one where lots of machinery is used. So just nota bene, note well, ladies and gentlemen, that's something to look out for. Another thing to look out for is this sort of example here. So here I'm calculating 5 firms, F1 through to F5, Industry A, Industry B, and you can see here that the concentration ratio for the 5 firms in both cases is 75%. So if you were just presented with that, you would think to yourself, alright, 75%, 5 firms, probably dominated by 5 reasonably large firms. However, look at the difference, ladies and gentlemen. In Industry B, we've got 15% for each firm, 15% market share. But look at Industry A, 1 very dominant firm, and then 4 very small firms. So we could see the scenario here where this firm is going to be very monopoly-like, should I say, in its behaviour, because it's got such an enormous hold on this particular industry. And these other very small firms will be fighting for the scraps and fighting over what's left. Now, one might compare that, of course, to, say, an oligopolistic industry, where, so for example, the supermarket industry in the UK, where we don't have firms of that size, obviously, 60%, but we do have firms which are knocking on the door of 30%. And so they have the ability, in some instances, to behave in the same way as a monopoly would, because they have that market power within the industry. So that's another thing to look out for. So if you're just presented with the number, don't just automatically assume we would be talking about this type of scenario where things are split evenly. We've got to delve into the numbers in a little bit more detail. And speaking of delving into the numbers, ladies and gentlemen, let me just move this along so I can present you with my, just move this along. And let me just talk, ladies and gentlemen, I'll zoom in on this a little bit so that we can see it a little bit better. Let me just talk, ladies and gentlemen, about this data, about minimum efficient scale. So this has come out of the Anderton textbook, for those of you who use it, page 389. And Anderton provides us with some data with regard to the size of the firm, or the market share that the firm requires, maybe a better way to put it, in order to work at its minimum efficient scale. Now, you all know that minimum efficient scale means that we're operating down here, we're talking about being productively efficient, minimum cost, being able to exploit all the economies of scale, lower your costs, maybe lower your prices as a consequence. But it's interesting, ladies and gentlemen, the data is interesting, and it provides us with some great numbers and some data that we could potentially include in, say, for example, an essay question. So I've just taken 4 of the industries which Anderton quotes and the market share. So number 1 is the steel industry, 15%. So you need 15% market share to be operating at minimum efficient scale in the UK. In the cigarette industry, you need 30% market share. In the ball bearings industry, you only need 4.4% market share. And in the refrigerator industry, you need 84% market share. So that's interesting, isn't it? And we need to consider why this might be the case. So the steel industry, think of the steel industry, you automatically think of enormous factories, production plant facilities, very substantial fixed costs of investment. And as we know, the greater the fixed costs are, the more and more you need to increase output in order to fully exploit the economies of scale. So we're really sort of thinking there about our natural monopoly diagram, like so, where we have the long run average cost curve falling continuously. So you need very big plant, very big output in order to fully exploit the economies of scale and bring prices down. This would suggest, of course, that in the case of the steel industry, there would only really be room for, what would that be, 7, 10 to 70, so seven firms, giving you 95% market share. In the cigarette industry, potentially only room for 3 firms to operate at scale. In the refrigerators industry, well, that's looking more like really a natural monopoly, isn't it? Only really room for 1 firm. And in the ball bearings industry, where you can imagine small plant, relatively low fixed costs required, then there's going to be room for between 20 and 25 firms in that particular industry. So this whole notion of the minimum efficient scale also helps us to consider how many firms will be in the industry and what the relative concentration ratio will be. So in this one, the concentration ratio, if all firms are operating at minimum efficient scale, is likely to be, the 7 firm concentration ratio. It also helps us to think about economies of scale and fixed costs and whether that particular industry is really knocking on the door of a natural monopoly, or whether, as is the case, for example, in say steel or cigarettes, where we'll have maybe a small number of large firms which we call oligopolies operating. So we can use all of this data to think about market concentration. So it's a very useful aspect of economics, and one which you, as I said at the beginning of this video, you may be assessed on in the Year 2 final micro exam. If you want some questions on this, ladies and gentlemen, go to the practice papers and you'll find a whole practice paper there on oligopoly and specifically market concentration. Okay, ladies and gents, hope that's been of use, and that's it for this particular video anyway. Bye for now.